I'm glad to welcome everyone, and today we'll be talking about type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Why do such changes actually occur, and why does our blood sugar rise? What needs to be done to effectively control blood sugar levels? And what can we do to prevent complications from arising? Watch this video until the end, and today you'll get tips that will help you in this process. Today, it is believed that type 1 diabetes is mainly either an autoimmune process, that is, for some reason, a malfunction occurs in our body and our pancreas stops producing insulin, specifically its beta cells. And the second reason is called idiopathic. Idiopathic in this context means, I don't know why this happened. So you need to understand that medicine does not have an answer to this question. Something happened, and for some reason, these cells started to function differently. If we look at type 2 diabetes, the reason they usually tell you is genetics. It's genetic. If your grandmother had it, then your mother will have it. And if your mother had it, then you will too. That's how they explain the development of diabetes. But there isn't a concrete answer that would actually allow you to verify this. And for example, there's what's called gestational diabetes, when a woman is pregnant and her blood sugar rises. For some reason, this is considered normal. And then, when the pregnancy ends, the blood sugar returns to normal on its own. Does this mean the pancreas has recovered? That the cells have become normal? So where does the sacred answer lie here, you know? What is the real cause? If we, of course, analyze this from the perspective of the classical approach, where there is an organ and it determines how to act, you will never find the answer. So let's look at this from the perspective of a holistic approach, which views the body as an integrated system, where the physical body is controlled by the brain, and from this brain there is a channel for perceiving information. This includes vision, hearing, smell, touch, tactile, and emotional sensations. From the perspective of a holistic approach, raising blood sugar is vital for us. And in our body, there are two substances, insulin and glucagon, that are produced by the pancreas and regulate this sugar level. If we need to fight something, resist something, or catch up with something, in other words, if we need to exert strength at this very moment, we need more sugar in our blood, because that's the fastest energy our muscles can get. And of course, in such a case, insulin comes into play, and the sugar present in the blood is instantly transported into the muscles. And we have energy and strength. But the level of sugar needs to be replenished constantly, and another hormone is responsible for this replenishment. This is glucagon. It helps maintain a normal level and a stable blood sugar level. This is how this process constantly takes place. And if we look at this from the perspective of reflex reactions, that is, a reflex is when we find ourselves in certain conditions. And in these conditions, in order for us to survive, a protective reaction is triggered. The example is very simple. You touch a hot frying pan, and to keep yourself from getting burned, you don't even think about which reaction to choose. It doesn't matter if it's an adult, a child, or someone with 2 university degrees. Whether you have a place to live or not, you still pull your hand away. In other words, a reflex reaction does not depend on your age, your social status, or what you think about it. You don't choose the reaction, your brain chooses it for you. So, when we look at this from the perspective of diabetes, type 1 diabetes accordingly is a reflex of constant struggle. We need to fight against something, to constantly resist something, to prove our point about something, and so on. And here there's a very important point, because people confuse the idea that stress causes high blood sugar. But then, what about athletes? They're also under stress, they're also fighting. This is a big mistake. What exactly is this mistake? For a reflex to be triggered, an event in a person's life, in that person's perception, must be unexpected, negative, and isolated all at once. Isolated means experienced within oneself, internally, and the person doesn't share this event with anyone. And so, when we talk about type 1 diabetes, or so-called insulin-dependent diabetes, this is a reflex of constant struggle. When does this struggle get triggered? It happens when a child, for example, a very small child, has to resist something. For example, resist what? It's the pressure from parents when they say, you have to do this, but I don't want to do it. Why do I have to do it? Thank you. Why do I have to study at this school? Because otherwise you'll grow up to be, for example, some kind of fool, and if you study poorly, you'll end up twisting horses' tails. That's how they always explain it. And the child doesn't understand why they disagree with their parents' decision, disagree with the teacher's decision, disagree with the decisions of older siblings, or with the decisions of those around them. And when something is too important for them, a defensive reflex kicks in. Which one? It's a spike in blood sugar. Here's another point. This happens, for example, when we resist a certain situation. For example, situations at work, constant problems, stress at work, having to defend your position, save your colleagues, find money somewhere, pressure from the tax authorities, pressure from the government, in other words, a constant struggle. And this struggle is unpredictable. Someone could come at me from any corner. The reflex will also be triggered, and blood sugar will also rise as a protective reaction. Also, when we oppose certain decisions, for example, decisions made by the government says, "Men, you are not allowed to leave the country." How is that possible? Why can't I leave? What is this? Your blood sugar can already go up. The same goes for a soldier. When I disagree with the commander's decision, when he does everything wrong, my comrades are dying, and so on. All of this leads to a fight or flight reflex, and blood sugar will rise. But why does this situation occur more often in children? Because children always take this, so to speak, at face value. They are more sensitive to it. And here some people will immediately have a question. But what about when a child is born and is immediately diagnosed with high blood sugar and given a diagnosis of diabetes? What is the child fighting against? After all, the child is not aware of anything. This question is not for the children. This question is for the mother. What was she fighting against during pregnancy? You should know that any emotional reaction of a woman during pregnancy physically affects the life and health of her children. So this is a question for the mother. Now let's move on to so-called type 2 diabetes. Why does this situation arise there? Why does blood sugar start to rise? There is also a fight or flight reflex involved, but there is another option, an additional one. This is what is called aversion. I find this disgusting, I find this repulsive. And very often, those who develop type 2 diabetes say, for example, I was working in a hospital, saw blood flowing, got scared, fainted, and after that my diabetes started to get worse. In other words, blood. The sight of urine, feces, that is, this disgust that arises, plus the struggle, I don't want this, will lead to the onset of diabetes. So there is an additional aspect here. And what is the important point here? It's that neither of these reactions can be controlled by your conscious mind. Diabetes, that is, elevated blood sugar, doesn't attack you. It's a protective reaction, and as long as you remain in that environment, where this reflex has been triggered, nothing will work out for you. The blood sugar will continue to rise as a protective reaction. Now let's break down what we can actually do in order, on the one hand, to turn off the reflex so that blood sugar returns to normal, and on the other hand, to additionally lower blood sugar. Now let's move on to the step-by-step algorithm for managing diabetes. It's important to clearly understand that blood sugar rises not because you're broken or some terrible disease has attacked you, but because it's a protective reaction. Without understanding this, without realizing that this is a reflexive protective reaction, you end up in a vicious circle. What kind? You start fighting once again with the enemy that has settled inside you in the form of diabetes. The reflex to fight is triggered again, and your blood sugar rises once more. That's why you can never win this way. You always lose. So first, you need to understand that blood sugar, the rise in blood sugar in particular, is a reflexive reaction. And it was triggered there because the fight or flight reflex occurs. So by getting out of this reflex, that is, by changing the conditions where the reflex was triggered, changing schools, changing your parents' attitude, changing your job, changing your husband or wife, changing your commander. That is, you need to change the place and the reason the reflex is triggered. Only in this way can it be turned off. You can't just tell yourself, no, I won't think about it. It doesn't work that way. Because no matter how much you think about the frying pan, you will still pull your hand away if you touch it. No matter how much you think about not sweating in the sauna and whether you think you'll feel great or terrible there, it doesn't matter. As soon as you enter a sauna where the temperature is above 45 degrees, you will still sweat. In other words, you don't choose the reaction. This reaction is triggered automatically. So if you want this reaction not to be triggered, you need to change the conditions where it arises. This is a very important stage. Psychology doesn't work here, you need to understand that. So only a biological solution, changing the place and the cause of its occurrence, will work. The next stage. Of course, when blood sugar rises, the first aid is to administer agents that quickly lower blood sugar. If it's type 1 diabetes, unfortunately, we can only use insulin. It's important to understand that insulin was invented over 100 years ago, in 1922. And of course, since then, no one has been cured of type 1 diabetes with the help of insulin. But it simply made it possible to control blood sugar. In type 2 diabetes, if blood sugar is too high, sugar-lowering tablets are prescribed. But it's important to understand that this is step number 2, and it's necessary in order to have time to carry out step number 1. Without this, nothing will work. The main reason for failure is reflex, and as long as it remains active, blood sugar will stay elevated. As the third step, we can use additional methods that will reduce both the amount of insulin used and the level of sugar-lowering medications. What are these? So, first, it's physical activity. That is, you need to exercise intensively. Not just light, measured exercise like simply taking a walk, but rather doing intensive squats, running intensely, or cycling hard, for example. It doesn't matter what you choose, the exercise should be intense, appropriate for your age and your abilities. This will use up sugar and your blood sugar will decrease. Additionally, what else can we use? These are natural remedies that lower blood sugar. So, what are these remedies? And yes, these are the ones that have been proven. Dandelion root, bean pods, bilberry leaves, and what is called common lady's mantle. These remedies have proven effectiveness in lowering blood sugar. And remedies like, for example, stevia, well, there are a lot of questions. You now have the recipe on your screen. First, this is a recipe for dandelion root, which you can use as a single remedy. And you can use this infusion daily. Next, a very important point, in my opinion, is that I also want to recommend another recipe to you, which includes a set of remedies that also lower blood sugar very well. You can also see it on your screens now. Don't rush, pause the video at this point, take a look at this recipe, and please write it down. Remember one very important thing, you cannot take this on a continuous basis. I recommend taking either one option or the other for 1 month. Then you take a break for 2 months and return to it again. You can combine these recipes, use it for 1 month, take a 2-month break, then on the 3rd month. On the 4th month, use dandelion root. In other words, you can alternate them, like this. But what's important, please remember that these recipes do not eliminate the reflex. That's why you need to go back to point number 1. Physical activity does not eliminate the reflex. You need to go back to point 1 again. Very often people fall into this kind of, let's say, trap. They say, oh, I'll just do a little bit of this, my blood sugar will go down and I'll feel fine. Please remember that until you eliminate the reflex, that is, until you understand it and remove the cause, the sugar, the defensive reflex, will keep rising. Let me give you an example with 2 scenarios. So the first one is type 1 diabetes. A little girl who just turned 4 years old. And now she started going to kindergarten. And for her upbringing, they also brought in her grandmother to help. The grandmother is an honored teacher who knows exactly how everything should be done, how to properly raise children. And so, when this child came home, in order to help her do better at kindergarten, the grandmother started teaching her letters, but not in the form of a game, but rather as something that had to be done, that had to be written in a certain way. Because if you don't do it, nothing good will come of you. That was exactly the approach. An approach the child disagreed with, but she couldn't do anything to oppose her grandmother. As a result, the child's blood sugar started to rise. What would have been the right decision here? Yes, it's the grandmother. Yes, it's her. She is a very good person. We love her very much, but she is the one the child struggles with, specifically with her methods. So the grandmother left, and she never took part in raising this girl again. And the child's blood sugar gradually started to decrease. Now, an example of type 2 diabetes. 2 men, both soldiers, suffered severe injuries. One had his limbs amputated, the other had his arm amputated, and unfortunately lost one eye. Both of them are trying to obtain disability status. But because certain officials create obstacles to obtaining it, they have to fight and prove their case. So, while they are dealing with this bureaucratic machine, both of them experience a rise in blood sugar. And so they didn't have diabetes before, but now after 2 months, they're additionally diagnosed with diabetes. This is a very telling example. Look what happened next. So, one of them, the one who had his legs amputated, says no. I'll prove it. I left a part of my body there. They owe me this. And he continues to fight against this bureaucratic system. And of course, his blood sugar keeps rising and rising. The second one acted differently, following the recommendation. After listening to the recommendations, he said, yes, I'll do everything I can. Whatever I get, I get. If I don't get it, it's not a big deal. The main thing is that I survive. And his blood sugar gradually went down. This example of the 2 soldiers shows whose blood sugar will go down and whose won't. That is, you don't need to constantly fight within yourself, resist, or try to prove something. You need to understand what a reflex reaction is, and according to the algorithm that was presented to you earlier, help yourself. Thank you all for your attention.